Why are we inspired? In this edition of the NeuroCrush podcast, we are exploring the intersections of neuroscience, mental health, and creativity, tackling the fascinating question, why we are inspired. To do so, we delve into the lives of Vincent van Gogh, the tormented genius of art, Kumagasu Minakata, the polymath naturalist, how seizures and mental health disturbances could in both have influenced their profound creativity. We also delve into the role of pathos in unlocking our eureka moments. Vincent William van Gogh was born 30th March 1853 and lived a short life. He died 29 July 1890. A Dutch post-impressionist painter, he was among the most influential and famous figures in the history of Western art. In just over a decade, he created approximately 2,100 artworks, including 860 oil paintings, most of them in the last 2 years of his life. He was only beginning to gain critical attention before he died from a self-inflicted gunshot at the age of 37. And during his lifetime, he managed to sell only one of his paintings, The Red Vineyard. He is one among many famous personalities in history who have rightly or wrongly been credited from suffering with epilepsy. But he also seems to have suffered from symptoms of brain and mind, hallucinations, mood swings, and explosive impulsive behavior that have been variously attributed not just to epilepsy but also bipolar disorder and Meniere's disease. He was a very productive painter, and he was a very prolific letter writer as well. So much so that he had these bursts of creativity. In one short period in Arles, 1888 to 1889, he produced 200 paintings, 200 watercolors, and wrote 200 letters to his brother Theo and his other associates of 1,700 pages, the shortest being 6 pages long. Vincent van Gogh was therefore hypergraphic in both letter and in painting. Hypergraphia has been described as a very cardinal feature of temporal lobe epilepsy and a syndrome linked to temporal lobe epilepsy, the Geschwind syndrome, which we'll talk about a little bit during this podcast. He seems to have had seizures, having one even when he was painting, and this has been described by the Harvard neurologist Gogh, that there is a painting called Over the Ravine where the brush strokes indicate that Vincent van Gogh had a seizure while doing that painting. Indeed, even the canvas seems to have been torn. The Geschwind syndrome has traits of mood swings, irritability, and anger, but Van Gogh also demonstrated other features of that syndrome, both hypo, a decreased interest, and hyper, an increased interest in sexuality, were reported in him. He is also described as being variously homosexual or bisexual in this period. His intense emotionality was triggered in arguments with Paul Gauguin, with whom he shared a close relationship, and he experienced hallucinations. Indeed, on one occasion, he was provoked to be so aggressive that he experienced a biblical injunction, if thine offend thee, pluck it out. And he turned the razor famously on his own ear, which led to his painting the self-portrait of the man with the bandaged ear. Indeed, this intense relationship with Gauguin also brings about another trait in him, that he had great difficulty in terminating arguments and discussions, what we describe in neuropsychiatry as emotional stickiness. And it's after an intense argument with his physician where he threatened him that, being rebuffed, he walked out and he shot himself, and he died after a couple of days. Van Gogh was the son of a preacher, and he himself had been a preacher for a period of time, and early in his life, therefore, hyper-religiosity also perhaps played a role. The Geschwind syndrome of temporal lobe epilepsy is thought about as an interictal syndrome. And when we say interictal, what we mean is that it continues between the periods of having seizures. The temporal lobe, if you draw a line between your ears, is exactly there. On either side, it is the oldest part of the brain, what we call the limbic brain. It houses the hippocampus, the center of memory, and the amygdala, the center of emotion, both of which we will refer to in some time during the course of this podcast. But when the seizures come from the temporal lobe, and one has chronic epilepsy coming from the temporal lobe, then the Geschwind syndrome has been described as characterized by intensified and labile emotionality, a viscosity, which is orderliness, excessive attention to detail, and a kind of a persistence, being very, very dogmatic about many things. I talked about hypo, decreased interest in sexual matters, and sometimes hyper, increased interest in sexual matters. Religiosity, once again, which is expressed either as religious, ritualistic experience or as excessive interest in spirituality. And hypergraphia, a tendency to write considerably but not necessarily creatively. These behavioral features appear to come from a disturbed temporal lobe, and that's what we see in temporal lobe epilepsy. On the other hand, while we think about these emotions and behaviors as problematic, can you imagine your life without emotions? Bear Connors and Paradiso in the book Neuroscience, Exploring the Brain, ask this question. To appreciate the significance of emotions, just imagine your life without them. Instead of the daily highs and lows we experience, life would be a great empty plane of existence without significance. Without question, the expression of emotion is a large part of being human. And I think this is very, very important for us to understand that on the one hand, emotions and behaviors, as I have described in the case of Vincent van Gogh, can be quite problematic for the person and the people around them. But on the other hand, it's extremely important that we experience emotions, because without emotions, our life would be a meaningless plane of existence. There is an emotional circuit in our brain, and it was described by Pappas, and therefore it's called the Pappas circuit. And to those of you who are watching the video version of this podcast, you'll be able to see in the diagram that not only does this occupy the middle part of the brain on either side, it also is extremely hormone and chemical rich. So it's not just the structures, it is the connections which are neurochemical connections which make this emotional circuit extremely significant. We move from Vincent van Gogh to talk about another very interesting person with temporal lobe epilepsy, Kumagasu Minakata. He was a Japanese naturalist and a polymath. He left Japan quite early in his life and went to study in the US. He spent many years shifting universities in the US and then in Europe and the UK, but never really acquired a formal degree or qualification. Yet, he wrote hundreds of papers on religion, folklore, and natural history, and he was deeply, deeply interested in natural history, including 50 papers in the famous British journal Nature. So famous was he that the Emperor of Japan established for him in later years the Minakata residence in Wakayama Prefecture, and even now it stands in testimony to a lot of the work that he did. He was hyper-spiritual. He was actively involved in the anti-shrine consolidation protests and the nature conservation movement in Japan, so much so that his repeated efforts eventually led to that entire governmental movement petering out. He was a virgin until age 41, which might depict his decreased interest in matters sexual. He wrote minuscule letters in compact space and wrote a tremendous number of articles, which in itself indicates hypergraphia. He is described as having been intense, emotional, short-tempered, and irritable. Indeed, on more than one occasion, he was in trouble due to alcohol consumption resulting in hyper-emotionality, and this was to play out both when he was a student in an American university and later in his life when he was in England. It actually, in both these instances, it really changed the course of his life. Kumagasu Minakata had temporal lobe epilepsy with what we call deja vu experiences. Deja vu experiences are experiences where you feel as if you have been in this situation before. The sense of deja vu. And what makes his case very interesting, because it's just another temporal lobe epilepsy story, is what you might think. Just another Geschwind syndrome story, you might think. But what makes him very interesting is that his brain was preserved for posterity, and in some years later, Murray and colleagues have studied the post-mortem brain in MRI. And guess what? They found that he had right hippocampal atrophy. And I'm now going to talk a little bit about these structures in the limbic system and why they are relevant. Before that, let me remind you that Minakata, just like Van Gogh, had many features of the Geschwind syndrome. Intensified and labile emotionality, viscosity, which is orderliness and excessive attention to detail and persistence, a decreased interest in matters sexual, hyposexuality, an increased hyper-religiosity or hyper-spirituality in his case, and clearly hypergraphia. He wrote considerably. What you're seeing if you're watching the video edition of this podcast is an image, an MRI image of the brain. And what you can see within the box is the part of the brain that is extremely important for human emotion. And what you see circled in green is the amygdalo-hippocampal complex. And this is where the hippocampus, the seat of your memory, and the amygdala, the seat of your emotions, both reside. It's very important to understand that when memory and emotion are so close to each other, they cannot but influence one another, which is one of the reasons why many of our most enduring memories are emotion-laden. They have emotions strongly attached to them. And indeed, if I just gave you a set of facts without any emotions attached, you're far less likely to remember those facts than you are to remember facts that in some way trigger emotions or are linked with emotions for you. So this part of the brain is what we are talking about. And this part of the brain in temporal lobe epilepsy typically atrophies or becomes sclerosed, which is damaged due to repeated injury in a person with temporal lobe epilepsy on one side when compared to the other. And when we say that Kumagasu Minakata had a smaller right hippocampus, what we are saying is that this part of the brain had become shriveled, and his temporal lobe epilepsy most likely came from his right temporal lobe. Now, the right is something that I'd like you to remember, because later in this podcast we'll talk a little more about why that right is significant rather than left. The amygdala is a very, very interesting part of our brain. It is Greek for almond. It's a really small structure. It's made by a number of subnuclei, and it has inbound pathways coming from all the sensory systems, each with a different projective pattern. Very interestingly, when the amygdala is damaged, say for example in an accident, or when it's removed, then it causes fearlessness. So there is something called the Clover-Bucy syndrome, where the amygdala has been removed as part of the temporal lobe, and after a bilateral temporal lobectomy, the monkey is fearless. The monkey will go and play with the snake, which, as you know, monkeys are deathly scared of snakes. Electrical stimulation of the intact amygdala has also been shown to increase vigilance, which is your sustained attention, and indeed it can also lead to fear and violent aggression. So the amygdala clearly has a lot to do with human emotion. And I'm reminding you again that it's right next to the hippocampus, which is the house of all your memories through your lifetime. Now, how does having electrical activity, as you do in epilepsy, make a difference to how you think, feel, and behave? How does it influence human thought and feeling? Baer and Fedio, who did some very interesting temporal lobe epilepsy research way back in the 1970s, had this hypothesis. They pointed out that when you have increased electrical activity in your temporal lobe, there is an enhanced connection between all your sensory inputs, your seeing, your hearing, your feeling, your smelling, your tasting, and the processing that goes on in your emotional center. And therefore, what happens is that all your sensory experience becomes suffused with emotional coloration. So the difference between you and I, who may not have epilepsy, and a person with temporal lobe epilepsy in whom the electrical activity is continuously going on inside that part of the brain, is this, that all their sensory experiences become suffused by emotional coloration. And that may result in two kinds of things. One, an heightened perception about the world, and therefore a certain form of creativity, as you have seen in both these stories, and the other, an inability to manage their emotions and what we call emotional or affective dysregulation as a consequence. As part of this same research by Baer and Fedio, they pointed out that left brain dominant individuals in their study tended to be more ideological and philosophical in their approach. They were more motivated by social and pragmatic rather than emotional concerns, were more diligent, purposeful, capable of greater tenacity, and driven more often by a sense of duty. Interestingly, when compared to the caregiver, the left temporal lobe epilepsy person thought less well of themselves, so they tended to tarnish their own image. On the other hand, right-brained people may have a better appreciation of the world around them, greater creative ability, a proclivity for the finer aspects of life, and could be more mood and emotion driven rather than logical in making their choices, both day-to-day ones and those that are self-defining. And when compared to the caregiver, the person with right temporal lobe epilepsy was found to polish their own image. They thought better of themselves than their caregiver did. So these were interesting observations that came out from studying the temporal lobe in epilepsy. Now, when you study the whole aspect of creativity and emotion, there is no doubt that we see the right hemisphere of our brain, the right half of our brain, as the creative half. It also happens to be the emotional hemisphere. The vast majority of studies, just like that of Kumagasu Minakata, have shown changes in the right temporal lobe in people with epilepsy associated with emotions and behavior. And there is a very large body of literature there, including more recently of what we call functional magnetic resonance imaging literature. The few studies that have done clearly show that there is a role for the right amygdala and the right hippocampus in hyper-emotionality or disturbed emotionality. So that right hemisphere dominant individuals are both emotional and creative may explain why many people in artistic pursuits tend to express both qualities of emotionality and qualities of creativity. It's as if these two tend to go with each other. Right hemisphere research has shown that the use of language, poetry, and metaphor produces heightened activity in that hemisphere. We also know that creative pursuits are strongly associated with disorders of the mind, both bipolar affective disorder and schizophrenia, and that in poetry there are several such examples of an overlap. Which brings us then to the soul, an exploration by Michael Trimble in his book The Soul in the Brain. He describes the soul as a noun variously defined as psyche, inspiration, and energy. It may be considered the vital force that inspires, energizes, and stimulates us. We can study its manifestations and effects in all human activity having these qualities. And he goes on to ask the question, why are we, the human race, so moved by poetry, music and art that we are reduced to tears, not tears of sorrow, but of elation and ecstasy? Most of us have had this experience of an outpouring of emotion which follows a very beautiful piece of music, a very uplifting experience of art or culture, maybe an experience of nature, or indeed when one watches a movie with emotions that are very poignant. And our outpouring of emotions really comes from what we call the mirror neurons in our brain. And what is very, very important is that our ability to feel emotion, therefore, is an integral part of having these experiences, of having elation, having ecstasy. And we do have the example of many Indian saints and seers like Tyagaraja, who used to be moved by songs and thoughts of Lord Rama, Purandaradasa, who was moved by songs and thoughts of Lord Vithoba, Subramanya Bharati, who was moved by his thoughts of his motherland and the need for his motherland to be liberated. Trimble has postulated that creative expression may be therefore a vicarious marker of the human soul, because we don't have any real marker of the human soul, the soul being such an abstract concept. That creative expression may involve a critical mass of brain structures underpinning it. It doesn't mean that these markers or these brain structures house the human soul, or not even that they are soul representation, but that the soul as we see it may well be the genesis of human inspiration. Which takes us back to that thought from the podcast on Jiddu Krishnamurti. What are these eureka moments when your brain, mind and soul start Trinity talking? These are moments when there is sudden clarity that follows a period of confusion and turmoil, what is often referred to in Old English as pathos. In these moments, we experience unique insights, we contemplate momentous decisions, and possibly we take definitive steps that may have an impact on our whole life. In these moments, we experience a deep understanding of the self and the world around us. And clearly, these are precious moments when our thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and rewards meet, leading to inspiration. Really, when our brain, mind, and soul are in connect with each other. And Trimble puts the fascinating possibility in front of us that one could study the soul by associating inspirational human experience, religion, music, poetry, and literature with the brain. And that this is tantalizing, to say the least, is what he says in his book Soul and the Brain. Now, these Trinity talking moments, how do you understand them? They're probably best understood in people who excel in their creative expression, no matter which domain. Think of Einstein and Edison in science. Think of Jobs and Musk in business. Think of Pasteur and Nightingale in medicine. Think of Van Gogh, whom we spoke about, or indeed Picasso in art. The list goes on. But clearly, to be so creative in their professions, for their work to lead to discoveries, these individuals could have had frequent moments when their brain, mind and soul were in sync. Their creative expression was coming out in a way that it did not usually come out. So the genesis of our inspirational moment therefore may start with pathos and bewilderment. And indeed, it's very, very important to remember that when one is going through turmoil, when one is questioning the need and the meaning of one's existence, when one is asking oneself hard questions about what one has achieved or struggling to find a way forward with a problem, this may actually present us with an opportunity rather than just be a challenge. Very often it is this pathos that leads to a eureka moment, and this comes out in following a number of people who have been through transformative experiences that Eureka moment is a moment of clarity and inspiration, and any creative expression that comes out of it need not only be aesthetic, it can be in thought, it can be in feeling, it can be in ideation, it can be in creation. Who then would you call a genius? Someone who is able to tag inspiration with expression would really then be a creative genius, whatever their field of endeavor. So there is hope for all of us. We understand that the human brain and mind have an extraordinary capacity for inspiration. We know that the majority of sages and savants were inspired early in their lives, and this clearly indicates the benefits of youth. All it might take is a Trinity talking moment, an inspirational connect between the brain, mind and soul. And remember, if it follows pathos, perhaps when struck with pathos, when struggling in the depths of despair, one should take heart and keep oneself open for that Eureka moment when your own Trinity starts talking. Let me finish with Rabindranath Tagore. He said, "A mind all logic is like a knife all blade. It makes the hand bleed that uses it." A quote that clearly extols for us the virtues of creative endeavor and the need to allow the creative side in us to be inspired to experience that Trinity talking moment, that Eureka moment. Please follow the Neurokrish podcast for more. Thank you. How many minutes?